Charles Leclerc dominated the Australian Grand Prix to extend his championship lead, while Max Verstappen suffered a second DNF with more reliability woes. Welcome to the Grand Prix-Cap for the Australian Grand Prix here on the 5 Red Lights F1 podcast. My name is Aaron Harper. In this episode, I'll share my thoughts on the race in Melbourne, debating all the major talking points and rating every driver's performance as well as the race as a whole. This podcast can be found on most podcast platforms such as Spreaker, Apple, Spotify and Google. You can also find it on YouTube along with many other videos like the Flying Lap, where I review every race and the headlines faster than the pole position lap time. Like, follow or subscribe wherever you're listening or watching, and if you'd be kind enough to rate the podcast on Apple, Spotify or just with a YouTube comment, that would be hugely appreciated. You can follow me on social media at 5_red_lights on Twitter and 5redlights on Instagram. I also have a blog site where I write F1 articles giving my thoughts on various F1 things, as well as my predictions for every race weekend. You can find it at 5redlights.wixsite.com/5RL podblog. Now let's get into the Australian Grand Prix-Cap. So first of all, before I dive into the story of the weekend and my race thoughts, I'll just explain why I sound terrible. I've been struggling with a cold since the middle of last week, so getting up early for the race and qualifying probably didn't help. But you know, I'm a hardcore fan. I have to do these things, no matter what the consequences are. But I'm getting better, and I'll put on the best show I can for you. So if it becomes too much for your ears, feel free to stop listening and come back another time. I'll completely understand. So let's start with practice on Friday, which I did not get up for. I recorded them and watched them back later in the day. Ferrari topped both practice sessions. Carlos Sainz fastest in P1 with a 19.8, and Charles Leclerc topping the FP2 times on an 18.9. So that boded well for Ferrari, who'd headed into the weekend a little bit worried actually about their performance levels. Sebastian Vettel returned, but his engine failed in FP1 and could not be fixed in time to get him out for the second session. He returned to the pit lane using a scooter, which earned him a trip to the stewards and a £5,000 fine, which it's just a bit silly. I mean, he's got to get back to the pits somehow, and the quickest way is obviously to use the track, unless there was an obvious thing in the way, like removing a car. But his car was the thing that stopped the sessions, so he knew where it was, and it was perfectly safe to go back. To be honest, it was just a bit silly, to be honest. Now, Red Bull, they were faster on the back straight than anybody, but they looked to be lacking balance in the final sector, and Ferrari were edging performance in sectors 1 and 3, which kind of continued the trend of Ferrari being able to exploit more downforce and more corner performance, and Red Bull having a package that was faster on the straights, which makes a real change from tradition. The high rate concept which Red Bull used, and the blown diffuser car that they had back when Sebastian Vettel was winning the championships, they struggled for straight line speed, so it makes a bit of a turnaround to see Red Bull being the most potent car in a straight line. Alpine, they showed well on Friday with P4 and P6, while Valtteri Bottas continued to use Alfa Romeo's pace well. McLaren offered a glimmer of hope with 8th and 10th in second practice, following up from 5th and 8th in the morning, although Mercedes struggled and they finished the day 11th and 13th, with Lewis Hamilton saying afterwards, "Nothing we change makes a difference." And George Russell backed that up, saying, "The porpoising into turn 9 is probably the most severe I've felt so far." Haas had a tricky Friday with Kevin Magnussen feeling unwell and Mick Schumacher being held back by car issues. So we headed into FP3, and again, I didn't watch this. I didn't have time to really watch any of it back, but I caught up on the headlines, and by the looks of things, it was pretty wild, with both Aston Martins crashing out, leaving both drivers sweating on their participation in qualifying. Lando Norris, the surprise FP3 topper, at 10th ahead of Leclerc and Perez. Alonso backed up the Friday pace for the Alpine with 4th fastest, edging out fellow Spaniard Sainz. But Verstappen entered qualifying on the back foot, struggling for car balance again and having a spin at the penultimate corner. Mercedes were also on the back foot, still having major issues with the porpoising, resulting in the car being a complete handful for Lewis Hamilton and George Russell again. So we headed into qualifying. The stage was set, the grandstands were packed out, and we weren't really sure who was going to end up on pole position. So qualifying was an intense session with 2 red flags, the first of which was a pretty stupid collision between the Canadian pair of Lance Stroll and Nicholas Latifi. Stroll was let through by Latifi, who thought the Aston Martin driver was on a push lap. Then Stroll lifted off just after turn 5, and Latifi thought he would go past again. Stroll swerved to the right and made contact, claiming he was looking out for cars on a push lap behind. I think the Alfa Romeo of Guan Yu Zhou was behind them. But overall, just a bit of a dumb incident, to be honest. And this is the problem with everyone trying to jostle for position on their out laps, their in laps and push laps. It gets a bit ridiculous. I mean, maybe there should just be not necessarily a written rule, and maybe a gentleman's agreement that is firmly enforced by the GPDA of no overtaking unless you're on a push lap. If you're not on a push lap, then you stay behind the drivers in front unless they pull off the circuit. It would solve this. And to be honest, if you have to build up temperature, then do 2 laps. And we saw the drivers having to do 2 push laps to get the maximum lap time because the tyres weren't coming up to temperature. So, it's just, I know everyone's trying to compete, but this is going to end badly one day, so we need to nip it in the bud. And this needs to be a lesson to all the drivers, not just those guys at the back who are sons of rich businessmen. That's not to say that Stroll and Latifi don't deserve a place on the F1 grid, but they're making themselves look a bit stupid and a bit incompetent by having silly accidents. Let's jump forward to the positives from qualifying. Charles Leclerc snatching a late pole position by a quarter of a second from Max Verstappen in the end. A really nice lap from Charles Leclerc, and Ferrari just had the pace through quali. Unfortunately, Carlos Sainz, he had his struggles, and we'll get to those in a little bit. But Red Bull didn't really have an answer. Verstappen getting himself onto the front row alongside Leclerc. Perez missed out on another front row, and he would start 3rd. Lando Norris, he finished 4th fastest in an improvement for McLaren, and teammate Daniel Ricciardo picking up 7th on the grid. It was a great day for the Woking team, showing their improvements, and the fact that the car just suited the track much more than it had in Bahrain, and building on the improvements from Jeddah. Mercedes locked out row 3, which for a time didn't look likely at all. It looked like they could be struggling to get into Q3. Lewis Hamilton ended up edging out teammate George Russell, and they lined up 5th and 6th. Although they wouldn't have lined up there if Fernando Alonso had finished his lap. He looked set to challenge for the top 3, maybe even pole position, but he'd crashed after a purple middle sector, and then that brought out the red flag in Q3, which kind of hampered Carlos Sainz. He had a disaster in the 3rd part of qualifying. He missed out on his first lap when Alonso caused the red flag. Then his engine wouldn't start at the restart, which hampered his tyre preparation. So he had to go out and immediately push. The tyres were too cold. He ended up in 9th place. A little bit of news post-qualifying. Lance Stroll picked up a 3-place grid drop for the collision with Latifi, which dropped him from 18th to 19th because Alex Albon was disqualified from the session after stopping on track with a lack of fuel, so he couldn't provide a fuel sample, which meant he was disqualified from the session. Leclerc and Verstappen had gone head-to-head in both races so far, taking a victory apiece. Starting on the front row together again, how would the race pan out?
Into position on the back row. The green flag means it's time to look to the front row and the lights for the return of the Australian Grand Prix. They leave the line in Melbourne, and it is a good getaway for the post. It's a poor start for Max Verstappen, and Sergio Perez is threatening his teammate. Charles Leclerc will hold the lead into turn number 1, then comes Verstappen, and look at that leaping through. Lewis Hamilton got a mighty second phase of the start, and he moves up to up to 3rd position on 2 places. So that's a mighty getaway, and not what Perez needed at all. So he drops down to...
And of course, we know Charles Leclerc won the race. And he won the start. He displayed a standard of race pace that was unexpected, really. The Red Bull looked like the faster car through the weekend on the longer runs. But Charles, he simply drove away at upwards of half a second a lap with the TV cameras barely picking him up. But there was one time where they cut to him coming out of the penultimate corner. I thought, oh, they're only picking him up because he's got a problem. But no, it was just serene, and he was getting on with it, even though his car was bouncing up and down like a big red bouncy castle, sort of kangarooing its way down the straights. It didn't lack for speed, that's for sure. So, Mercedes are having the problems with the porpoising, but it's not holding Ferrari back. So there's a deeper issue than just porpoising causing a loss of lap time. And the Monegasque just gapped Verstappen with ease, and he never even lost the lead, even through the pit stops. He led every lap. There was one moment of concern at the second safety car restart, where the Ferrari understeered wide at the final corner. They'd just put the hard tyres on the Ferrari when the safety car came out, so obviously building temperature into those was tricky, and it allowed Verstappen to make his one and only challenge to Charles's lead. Leclerc just simply in a class of his own after he'd managed to hold on to the position. He managed his pace and was able to extract insane speed with so much ease, setting the fastest lap of the race on the final lap and taking the victory. It was just a brilliant performance. He was totally in charge, and there was no question to him winning the race. The only thing that could have got in his way was unreliability, but the Ferrari has looked very reliable. But it was a different story for his teammate Carlos Sainz, who followed a terrible Q3 with a wretched and short-lived race. He started on hard tyres in 9th place, had to change the steering wheel just before the formation lap, which wasn't set up correctly. And then he dropped 4 places at lights out because the car went into anti-stall. Then he was fighting with Mick Schumacher on lap 2, and he spun off. He went off at turn 9, spun across the track, very lucky not to be collected, and he ended up having his Ferrari beached in the gravel trap. It kept a rough weekend for the Spaniard because the pace was there. He could have been on pole position. He could have, at worst, he would have been in the top 4, and he wouldn't have had to maybe start on the hards. Would he have been able to challenge Charles for the win on ultimate race pace? Obviously, we'll never know, but the Ferrari was the car to have this weekend, and it would have been fascinating to see the two Ferrari boys go at it wheel to wheel, especially with Verstappen and Perez dropping out of the picture. That would have been a very interesting tussle. So no points for Carlos Sainz, and there was also no points for Max Verstappen, who broke down just past half distance. 25 points from the opening 3 races. The Red Bull lacking race pace this weekend, and 6th in the driver's standings for the world champion. Far from the beginning to his title defence that the Dutchman was aiming for. The world champion had graining on the mediums in the first stint, locked up at the second to last corner and ran a little bit wide. Lost a lot of time to Leclerc in that phase of the race. Challenged after the safety car restart, but the pace just wasn't there for Red Bull to take the fight to Ferrari. On this occasion, the Red Bull team have given very little information so far about the actual cause of retirement, but what we do know is it's related to the fuel system, again, because Max could smell fluid leaking from the car, so it might just be a piping issue. Maybe something had perished and it was just escaping that way, but not really what you want to see from a potential world championship winning team. That the engine doesn't keep the fuel in it, or it can't pick it up. It causes the car to stop, as it did in dramatic fashion for Sergio Perez in Bahrain. Work to do for Red Bull, although Christian Horner, and he was right to say this, he'd rather make a fast car reliable than a slow car fast. So, he's completely bang on that one. Now, the profiteers from Verstappen and Sainz's demise were Perez, Russell and Hamilton, and they finished in the positions behind Charles Leclerc. Perez had to pass both Mercedes on track. He pulled a superb move out on the outside of Lewis Hamilton into turn 9, crucially just before the Sebastian Vettel-induced safety car period. After the race, Sergio said, "Ferrari was super strong today. We couldn't match them at any point." And he was right. The Red Bull just did not have the pace. They'd accounted for rear tyre graining, but it was actually front tyre graining that was the issue. And their race was kind of stuck from there, and the best they could have done was a second and third, but all they got was a P2. Mercedes, they finished third and fourth, with George Russell picking up his first podium. He battled well against Sergio, but couldn't keep him behind. Lewis was a bit unfortunate with the safety car, and we'll touch a little bit more on everybody's race in the driver ratings. McLaren, they collected a 5th and 6th, with Lando Norris ahead of Daniel Ricciardo. Excellent for them. And there was a point for Alex Albon in 10th, which was brilliant for the Williams team, and which leaves Aston Martin as the only team yet to score after 3 rounds. Fernando Alonso, he'd threatened a great result but ended up last of the classified runners after his long strategy fell apart with grading on the mediums, and then he had to pit for a second set of mediums and was going for the fastest lap. He did do a faster lap than Charles Leclerc, but Leclerc also nailed the fastest lap on the final lap to deny Alonso that honour. The lower points scrap was fun, with Stroll doing his best to drive the widest possible Aston Martin known to man. There was a whole queue of cars behind him, and he got a penalty for weaving in his defence against Valtteri Bottas. It was quite interesting to see 6 or 7 cars running so close together, which was positive for the appearance of the new regulations. There was track changes, of course, to the Albert Park layout, and they were okay, with the braking zones probably not quite big enough to make overtaking a touch easier. Perhaps they removed the wrong chicane. Overtaking, of course, should not be easy by any stretch, or a simple drive-by with DRS. And I think this race was just about a fair balance. You needed to wrong foot your opponent with good racecraft to make the pass into turn 3, and that's kind of how it should be. You know, if you position your car well and you get a good run, because these cars allow you to follow a little bit more, if you can execute your strategy in terms of the overtake to put yourself in a good position, especially by forcing the driver to defend into turn 1 at Albert Park, and then you can get yourself a nice clean exit through turn 2 and pick up the slipstream for turn 3. A little bit of help from DRS, you can also then force your way down the inside, which was, you know, how we saw quite a few overtakes be achieved. So that was positive for both the track changes and for the new car regulations. The Red Bull and Ferrari battle is still in its infancy, but Ferrari have a clear advantage in terms of a driver-friendly car, reliability, and its adaptability to different layouts. They were very much ahead of Red Bull this weekend. Sainz could easily have been in P2 had things not got away from him. Leclerc making perfect use of the machine that he's got at his disposal. And the Scuderia appear in complete control of their destiny, with no dramas on the pit wall and an air of collected calm around the team. There's no wild hysteria to winning a race. There's no drama because Sainz has had an off day. It's far from the team that Sebastian Vettel was trying to win the World Championship with, where it was just all crazy. And I think that is down to maybe Mattia Binotto being in charge for a period of time. They could have got rid of him after 2020, where things kind of fell apart, but that wasn't really anything to do with him. And they recovered very well last year to pick up third in the Constructors. And they've absolutely nailed the regulation change for this year. As for Red Bull, they simply must just tidy up the technical gremlins, because it's just handing so many easy points to their rivals, and most notably, it's Mercedes they're handing the points to, because they've been on hand to collect a podium in both occasions that Red Bull have failed to finish, and Mercedes are struggling with their car. If Mercedes get on top of that thing, Red Bull could be in big trouble. Verstappen said, it's frustrating and unacceptable. These kind of things, if you want to fight for a title, cannot happen. And he's right, because at the moment, Red Bull, they aren't fighting for a title with Verstappen. If this carries on, they'll be fighting for a title with Sergio Perez, if they're fighting for one at all. As for Mercedes, they had their strongest showing in terms of pace, finishing with the sole Red Bull in eyesight. And Charles Leclerc, after his win, now has a 34-point lead in the drivers' standings over George Russell, who's in second place, and Ferrari are 39 ahead of Mercedes in the team standings. Now then, let's rate the drivers.
and P1.
Yes! Let's go, come on, yes!
And fastest lap.
I wanted to do it.
I know.
Oh, what a... Oh, amazing. The car was incredible today, really. Well done, guys. What a race and what a pace. I mean, we've been extremely strong. Good to see. Ah, so happy. So happy. Congratulations.
Fantastic.
So we're going to go in Constructors' Championship order from the standings after the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, so as they headed into Melbourne. And we'll start with Charles Leclerc, who started first, finished first, and I'm going to rate his performance as a 5. It was just a perfect display. And this is what he had to say after the win. It's the first win where we have controlled the gap. Honestly, what a car today. Of course, I did a good job all weekend, but it was not possible without the car. It was a perfect performance from Charles, as I said, securing a Grand Slam where, if you're not aware of what that is, it's pole position, the fastest lap, the race win, and you lead every single lap. Charles is driving with so much maturity. Will that hold up under home expectation in Imola? We'll just have to wait and see on that one, but the way he's driving at the moment, he's favourite for the World Championship, he's favourite to win the next race, and he's building so much momentum. I know there's 20 races to go, but he could very quickly run this championship away from anybody because he's just delivering at such a high level. As for his teammate Carlos Sainz, started 9th, he finished in the gravel, so he didn't finish. This is a bit harsh, but I'm going to rate Carlos's performance as a 1 because it was just there was some things out of his control, but the impatience and the way he failed to finish was just so un-Carlos. It was very disappointing, actually. Terrible day for Carlos. Couldn't get the hards working quickly enough. You could argue he was just driving angry after Q3 and after the terrible start. So all he needs to do is just put this behind him and respond in Imola. Get himself on the front row and pick up a really solid points finish. If possible, finish ahead of Charles. That is probably his aim going to Imola. Let's move to Mercedes, who were and still are second in the Constructors' Championship. Lewis Hamilton, he started 5th, finished 4th. I rate his performance as a 2.5. The start was great, got himself from 5th to 3rd. Early pace was decent, but he was caught out by the timing of the safety car, which came out about a lap or two after he'd pitted. In fact, I think it was on his outlap actually. It came out because he got passed by Perez. He stayed behind George Russell with an engine overheating issue when he closed up. And there was the out of context radio message, which is just a bit silly from Formula 1 because they're trying to create a narrative that's not really there. And he clarified it afterwards. And if you listen back to the audio as well, it has nothing to do with anything really other than the engine overheating and needing lifting and coasting. So the F1 directors need to just sort out their act there on the team radio, which is great, but let's not try and build a narrative that's not really there. George Russell, he finished qualifying in 6th. He finished the race in 3rd, and I rate his performance as a 3. It was an excellent display from George Russell, capitalising on the timely safety car. He'd have probably pitted on that lap anyway, so it just fell in his lap really. He defended hard against Perez, but he couldn't keep the Red Bull behind. It was just fundamentally a faster car. But another tidy race from the boy from Kings Lynn. Picks up his first podium in silver, and he's now second in the Drivers' Championship, albeit 34 points behind Charles Leclerc. Let's move to Red Bull and Max Verstappen. Started second, failed to finish. I rate his performance as 2.5. Oh dear, a costly DNF as we've already spoken about. But otherwise, Max did drive well. He'd gone into the race with some other issues regarding reliability, and he did his best at the safety car restart. But was he hampered by the new safety car guidelines, not allowing him to get alongside and attack properly? But they're there for safety reasons because you can't have people going side by side. That's just a recipe for disaster. Work to do for Red Bull and for Max. Lots of ground to claw back. He's nearly 50 points behind Charles Leclerc now in the championship, and that is going to take some overturning. Sergio Perez, he started third, finished second, had to recover from a good start. Well, actually a good getaway, but he'd lost a position to Hamilton into turn one because he kind of got blocked by his teammate and Charles Leclerc. But it was the performance that we've come to expect from Perez. He was never really a threat for victory after losing out at the start to Hamilton. His performance also gets a 2.5. Alpine's Esteban Ocon is next. He started in 8th and he finished in 7th, and I score him at 2.5. He beat Alonso again, but he really failed to tap into the potential of the Alpine because it was probably the fastest car outside of a Ferrari and Red Bull. But he does keep the point score ticking over for himself and for Alpine, which could be handy come the end of the season. It's a very long season, of course. Fernando Alonso, he qualified 10th after crashing in Q3, finished 17th and last of the classified runners. I rate his performance as a 2. What might have been for Fernando. The Q3 crash surely denying him a podium. And then graining on the mediums in traffic blew any remaining hopes of points. The pace was there. It just didn't come together for Fernando in the end. Kevin Magnussen in the Haas is next up. He qualified 16th and finished 14th. So I rate his performance as a 2. Haas lacked ultimate pace all weekend, but it wasn't going to be all glory all year, was it? But much more respectable than 2021 though, and considering Magnussen was not well Friday morning, it was, damage limitation. They didn't really tap into the setup of the car and perfect it, so probably as much as they could hope for there. Mick Schumacher, he qualified 15th, beat his teammate in qualifying and beat him in the race. Finished 13th, but I rate him as a 2. He was lucky to avoid Tsunoda's AlphaTauri behind the safety car. Was generally just a step behind Magnussen for pace all weekend, but somehow managed to finish ahead of him. So now we move to Alfa Romeo with Valtteri Bottas, who qualified 12th, his Q3 run ending, and he finished in 8th. So I score Valtteri at 2.5. More points for Alfa Romeo. Bottas driving very nicely indeed all weekend. His Q3 run, as I said, did come to an end. 103 consecutive Q3 appearances, but he kept his nose clean in a feisty midfield contest to bring home some valuable points. Zhou Guanyu qualified 14th, finished 11th. I rate his performance as a 2. If I didn't mention it already, Bottas is a 2.5. A quiet race for Zhou and P11 at the flag. Not really much else to say. Pierre Gasly in the lead AlphaTauri. He qualified 11th, finished 9th, rating a 2.5. The DNFs for the top guys give Gasly a pair of points on a weekend where AlphaTauri were generally uncompetitive in the midfield, which was kind of summed up by Yuki Tsunoda, who qualified 13th, which is respectable for that team, I suppose, but he finished 15th. A struggle of a race, rating of 2 for the Japanese driver. Fairly anonymous all weekend. He finished lower than he started despite the retirements of Sainz and Verstappen. So, yeah, disappointing for Yuki. I mean, how long before the axe looms over his seat in F1 and someone else gets that drive? McLaren, they found themselves down the order after a tricky opening couple of races, but they scored big points in Australia to jump up the order. So Lando Norris, he qualified a sensational 4th, finished in 5th. I rate his performance as a 3. A very good weekend for Lando. As I said, 4th in quali, 5th in the race. Couldn't stay with the Mercedes after the safety car because Magnussen was in the way, but a very good points haul for Lando and for the team. Daniel Ricciardo qualified 7th, finished 6th, also a rating of 3. Good performance on home soil, maximising McLaren's points score, and he finished right on Lando's tail, who was also managing an engine temperature issue. So Ricciardo maybe could have finished ahead of his teammate, but they decided to keep them where they were. Aston Martin, who now dropped to the bottom of the constructors table, so they'll be last in the next race in the Grand Prix-Cap. Sebastian Vettel returned with 17th on the grid and a failure to finish, a 1.5, because it was just a messy weekend, which really you can't... Well, you could say he's a 4-time world champion, he should be a little bit tidier, but considering he's coming back from illness and not really driven the car in anger for a month, it's hardly surprising. Just a messy weekend all around for the team. Power unit failure, 2 crashes, Seb owes his mechanics a good dinner out at a Silverstone restaurant, I think, when they return home. Lance Stroll qualified 19th with the grid penalty. Finished 12th though, so a rating of 2 for Lance. 5-second penalty for weaving and defending against Bottas. 3-place grid drop for Latifi collision. Crashed in FP3. Ooh, maybe the 2 rating is a bit generous, but at least he finished the race. And finally, we go to Williams. Nicholas Latifi qualified 18th, finished 16th, a rating of 1.5. Collided with Stroll in qualifying. That was stupid, as I've already spoken about. But in the race, I don't think we saw him on the screen once. It just wasn't noticed. He was just constantly last. But at least he didn't crash this time. Alexander Albon disqualified from qualifying, so started 20th. Finished 10th though, rate him as a 3.5. The longest of long strategies to pick up his first point since his return to F1. Yeah, brilliant. Well done to Alex for that. That proves the haters wrong. He scored points in the Williams quicker than George Russell did, so maybe Albon to Mercedes when Hamilton retires. That would be fun. So they are the driver ratings that I've given for the Australian Grand Prix. Let me know in the comments, or find me on Twitter, of course, and let me know if you think I've been too harsh or if I've overrated somebody this weekend. Now let's rate the race as a whole. It was not as exciting a race as the opening 2 rounds, largely thanks to the lack of competition at the front, although don't let that detract from Leclerc's performance. He was absolutely excellent. The midfield racing was decent, and there was definitely more overtaking with the new layout. The old T9 and 10 chicane might have been useful for the bigger braking zone, but the 4th DRS zone being removed definitely hurt the overtaking levels, although you could argue it would have become a bit too easy with it staying there. I'm going to give the race a 6 out of 10, as it was an improvement on the previous Aussie races, but how much of that was the track? How much of that was down to the new cars? Again, the new designs worked well and allowed drivers to stay close in battle. Just look at the train behind Stroll in the closing stages. That was pretty tasty. Another reason for me taking a little bit of points away from this race was the lack of soft tyre involvement, considering there was a gap between the soft and the medium tyres. So they brought the C2, C4 and C5, I think it was. Can't quite remember the actual numbers that they brought. But there was a gap between the soft and mediums, which I thought was great, because a late safety car or someone doing a longer strategy, get them on soft tyres and they would rip through the field. But the soft tyre probably was a bit too soft for this. It was great for qualifying though. It was very, very quick. Now I asked various other fans and podcasters for their race ratings, and here's what they had to say. From Grid Talk, Owen Medford gave the race an 8 out of 10. The race got a 7 out of 10 from Tom Downey, Carl King, Jared Partridge, Ruby Price, Matt Bugager and Channel F1. Jawad Yaqub also gave the race a 7 out of 10, but he also gave the atmosphere on the ground a 10 out of 10 because he spent the whole weekend basking in it in the paddock while he was working there. So go and check out some of his stuff on Instagram. He's taken some beautiful pictures of the action there. Dr. 46th on Instagram. Steve Jackson, Tom Horrocks and Louis Edwards scored the race at a 6 out of 10, just like I did, while Mostly Racing on YouTube gave the race a 3 out of 10, but declared that Charles Leclerc's Grand Slam deserved a 10 out of 10 rating. Jason Devine called the race a snooze fest and gave it a 2 out of 10, while Vanadium Formula 1 on Twitter gave the race a whopping 10 out of 10. Of course, let me know what you thought of the race. Rate it out of 10, either comment on the YouTube video or just ping me a message on Twitter or Instagram. The checkered flag is waving, and that means the end of another episode. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope you enjoyed my attempts at telling you my thoughts of the race, and I haven't murdered your eardrums with my sore throat and bunged up nose. If you made it this far, thank you so much for sticking with me. Although if you haven't, I totally understand. So don't worry. Remember to like the episode wherever you find it. And if you would like to rate the podcast on Apple or Spotify, I'd love to hear your feedback, and it would be hugely appreciated. I'm not sure if there'll be an episode between now and the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix in Imola, but there is more from me on the YouTube channel. You can go and check out the March results for Driver of the Month, and you can check out the flying lap recap of the race headlines. You can also check out my blog site where I give my predictions and write some F1 articles. My most recent non-prediction article was a review of the 2005 season, where I talk about how I think it was an underrated Formula 1 season. Obviously not all of them can be classics, but that's the most recent one, and it's one that I hold dear to my heart in terms of a personal affection for it. So go and check out those videos and those blog articles, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Aaron Harper, and this has been the 5 Red Lights. I'll see you when the 5 Red Lights go out.